Well, thank you, Joel, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to WM for the opportunity to reach all of you today, wherever you might be. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about climate solutions and how a kind of a hopeful and science-based perspective, what we call reaching drawdown, may be able to help us actually stop climate change. And as we think about these problems of the future and the bold innovations we have to partake on in order to change the world and make it a better one, sometimes it's instructive to kind of go back to the past just a little bit to reflect on how did we get here in the first place. One of the things that's always fascinated me is the fact that humans have always been changing the environment. In fact, our ancient ancestors, going back millions of years as hunters and gatherers and people manipulating just the communities around them, we had been changing the environment for a very long time. But something really changed in the last century or so, especially the last 50 years, where we stopped just changing the local environment around us and we started changing an entire planet in multiple ways, in multiple dimensions, and very, very quickly. And a lot of this happened because of, well, there are a lot more of us suddenly on the planet starting in the last 50 years. We flipped from being a rural species living mostly out in the countryside to suddenly becoming a very urban species. But most importantly is we built a truly global economy fueled with technology and transportation and things that enabled us to connect with one another all across the planet in incredible ways. If you think about it, in just the last 50 years, what we've seen is an explosion of human activity with a doubling of our population, but the economy growing 5 to 6-fold during the same time. And mostly because of this economic growth, we've seen a tripling of global food demand, a doubling of global water use, and a near tripling of the use of fossil fuels. In a way, we've just hit a big inflection point in the history of our species. In fact, more has changed in the last 50 years that has changed in the previous 6 million years of human evolution. So that's a pretty exciting time to be alive, and a very challenging one, of course. As we're thinking about this, though, we're realizing we live in a time now where our actions are disrupting an entire planet all at once in multiple ways. Some of those changes that we're seeing, of course, are really obvious, like clearing a forest here in the remote parts of the Amazon. Here's a satellite image of a very remote part of Bolivia in the Amazon in 1975. But we go back in the early 2000s and see it's been completely decimated, mainly to grow soybeans as animal feed, which are being shipped all the way to China for pork production. So globalization, increasing demand for meat, and so on, has helped to drive deforestation, a very visible change to our planet, such that we've lost about 30% of Earth's tropical rainforest already. That's extraordinary. We've also changed water resources at a global scale too. Here's a pretty good iconic vision of that. This is the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union in Central Asia. This used to be one of the world's largest bodies of inland water. But what happened is the Soviet Union diverted the rivers that used to feed the Aral Sea and shipped that water in a different direction so that it could be used to irrigate the deserts of Kazakhstan to grow cotton for export. And this is what happened to the Aral Sea. It's gone. We basically have changed the Earth's globe and rerouted water in ways that decimated one of Earth's greatest inland water features. So we've disrupted water resources on a global scale as well, everywhere from California to Mexico to North Africa to Central Asia and beyond. These changes to land and water that we can see very visibly with our own eyes are one thing. But the really big issue we have to face, of course, is how we're changing an atmosphere that touches everything on the planet and even our oceans. That is our climate system. So we humans, through the changes we've had across the planet, are changing not just the obvious things, but some of the little bit less obvious parts of our planet. And changes to Earth's climate are very, very serious. You all know the story. I won't go through it in great detail. But starting mostly in the 19th century, we began to increase greenhouse gases, including CO2, but also things like methane and nitrous oxide and other gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. CO2 alone has increased by about 50% since the Industrial Revolution began. And that 50% now puts CO2 levels at a higher place than they've been in at least 3 to 5 million years. This is geologically unprecedented for the planet right now to have CO2 levels like this. And guess what? Basic physics tells us that with more greenhouse gases trapping more heat in the atmosphere, the planet will warm up. And it did. In fact, the planet has warmed about 1 degree Celsius so far, probably a little bit more than that. And it's now very obvious to us that that warming is exactly driven by our actions of adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. There's just no denying this anymore. One point I want to mention here is a little footnote is we used to think that the discovery of this basic science that greenhouse gases would warm the planet could be attributed to a guy named Joseph Tyndall back in the 1860s. But that's not true, it turns out. It was an American woman named Eunice Foote, F-O-O-T-E, who actually first wrote about this in 1856. But as a woman scientist in the 19th century, she really was overlooked and not given proper credit until now. And I try to make it a point to mention her name and kind of right a historic injustice and remember this incredible woman who led American science, but also the suffrage movement in this country back in the 19th century. So even at the beginning of this curve, some very smart people knew that climate change was going to be real, and now we're living in it. So we're living in a time where we are transforming the planet in ways that could be very disruptive and could be very, very dangerous. If we change the climate more than we already have, it'll disrupt our food supplies, water, health, economy, and so on. This could be very, very dangerous. And some people are seeing climate change as almost something hopeless, like, oh my God, we're doomed. We're just no way we can solve this. Well, let me stop you right there. That is not true. It is not hopeless to stop climate change at all. In fact, I'll show you how we can do it. And in the process, we can make the world better. So far from being hopeless, addressing climate change is actually one of the biggest opportunities we have to rebuild the future, to build a better future, to build a future we want. Nobody wants to build a damaged planet where things are careening out of control. That's a really bad idea. We don't have to do that. We can choose a better future. And addressing climate change will be crucial to building a better future. And we can build a better future that not only addresses climate change, but also other things like the economy, equity, justice, other things that we care about can also be addressed at the same time. This is an opportunity to kind of reinvent the world. That's what we do at Project Drawdown, or drawdown.org if you'd like to see more. We're a nonprofit that is a resource of scientists and communicators that tries to be a place to share climate solutions. How do we actually solve the problem and move forward? Well, let me first tell you what the word drawdown means. Why do we even talk about it? Drawdown does not mean sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. Drawdown actually refers to a time in the future. If these are the level of greenhouse gases, and I've shown how they've been going up and up and up, here they are at the end of the curve where we are today. And we have a choice to make. We can continue to have greenhouse gases go up into the atmosphere, causing more warming, more damage, and more disruption, more of the bad stuff. Or, as we say during these times of a pandemic, we can bend the curve. We can choose a different and better future. At this point with the blue dot, this is the moment of drawdown. This is the time where we stop climate change. When greenhouse gas levels stop rising and they begin to slowly decline, that's when we've hit the good inflection point of basically stopping the problem. Just like a pandemic, we can draw down the amount of pollution, or we can draw down the number of sick people in the world. Both are good things of bending the curve. That moment of drawdown, when we stop the rise of greenhouse gases and when they start to decline again, that's the goal. That's the time when we stop the future of climate change from getting worse. And our mission, of course, is to help people get there as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. So how do we get there? How do we get to that moment of drawdown? Well, first, we have to be guided by science. Ignoring science is how we got into this mess. So to get out of it, we got to pay attention to a little bit of the science. But it's not that hard. The atmosphere is a big box in the sky, basically. It's something you can put things into and remove things from. Very simple. We humans are adding a whole bunch of pollution into that box, into the atmosphere. These arrows represent the economic drivers of the different sources of greenhouse gases. We have electricity in here, food, industry, transportation, buildings, and other stuff. That's us on the left-hand side, us putting pollution into the sky, causing climate change. We'll have to pay attention to that. But it turns out nature's in this mix too, and nature's actually removing a little bit of this pollution, about 40% of it, in fact, by using our forest and our oceans to absorb some of the greenhouse gases, what are called carbon sinks. The word sinks basically means to remove something from the atmosphere. And that difference of us putting pollution in as a source and nature removing some of it as a sink leaves behind about 60 to 59% of the pollution is left behind each and every year, building up, causing more climate change. So to address climate change, we've got to look at both sides of this picture and figure out how we can do two things. First, how do we remove the sources, bring them to zero? How do we phase out the sources of greenhouse gas pollution from electricity, from industry, from buildings, transportation, and food? How do we zero that out? At the same time, we've got to pay attention to the right-hand side of the equation and support nature, which is automatically removing some of these greenhouse gases for us, and maybe even add to it with new kinds of agriculture, maybe some machines, maybe planting more trees. But first, supporting what nature's doing already. So that's how we're going to be guiding ourselves to climate solutions. How do we do these things? First rule, though, is reduce the pollution before it even gets in the air. This is always going to be job number one. It's a lot easier to prevent pollution before it gets in the atmosphere than removing it later. But we might have to do some of both. So how do we reduce the sources? How do we go over here, zooming in, and figure out how to cut these things down to zero? Well, it's going to be a lot of work, and it involves multiple dimensions of the economy, but we can do it, and we must do it. We must bring these things down to zero over the next 2 to 3 decades at most. We've got 10, 20, 30 years to do a lot of this work. How do we do it? Well, the places to begin are to look at where the emissions really come from. 25% of climate change causing pollution comes from making electricity globally. These are global numbers. In each country, each state, the mix is very different. But globally, added all together, 25% of our actions from making climate change come from producing electricity. About 24%, about tied with this, is making food. Isn't that interesting? These two are about tied, and then we talk about electricity far more than we do the food system, but they're about equal. And interestingly, half of climate change is caused by making electricity and making food. That's half the problem right there. Then we have industry kind of making materials and processing waste, which a lot of folks on this conference today will probably care a lot about. Then we have transportation, moving stuff around. We have buildings that directly emit about 6% of our pollution. But of course, buildings use electricity and they're made from things produced in industry. So they have kind of a bigger secondary footprint than you might think. And the remaining 10% is kind of the energy business itself, refining natural gas and crude oil and other things. But interestingly, 90% of climate change can fit on one hand: electricity, food, industry, transport, and buildings is 90% of the problem. We can go through each one and look for solutions in them. At Drawdown, we've identified lots and lots of individual solutions, which I don't have time to go through, that add up to solving the problem. But I do want to show you kind of families of solutions. For example, how we produce electricity, but also how we use it. Interestingly, we find in electricity, a lot of the best solutions start with efficiency, just reducing the amount of electricity we need in general, regardless of how it's produced, and then switching how we produce it to renewable or no carbon sources of energy. The circles in these diagrams represents the size of the climate solution, kind of how big it would be in terms of billions of tons of carbon avoided, basically. And some solutions have two circles, an inner one and an outer one, that represents the range of our estimates over the next 20 to 30 years. So big circles mean big solutions, but we need all those circles added together to really get the job done, which is pretty interesting. We can go to food and look at solutions there too, because food is another quarter or so of climate change. And people are often surprised to find out in the food system, it's primarily because of deforestation, clearing land for animals, animal feed, palm oil, and timber. Methane, mostly from animals, cattle and so on, for milk and dairy. A little tiny bit from rice. And then something called nitrous oxide, because we use too much fertilizer and manure on a lot of the farms in the world. So it's kind of forest, meat, and fertilizers. Those are kind of the biggest levers. Everything else in the food system is the remaining 5%, and that's important too. But again, food solutions start from an efficiency perspective. Let's use move food more efficiently by reducing food waste. About 30 to 40% of all the food in the world is wasted. So tackling that turns out to be the number one climate solution in the food sector, and one of the biggest ones overall. Changing our diets also helps a lot. Shifting some diets, at least to more plant-based diets, would make things a lot better in many cases. Protecting ecosystems from being cleared, protecting forest, especially forest on top of peatlands, so we don't burn those down, contributing to climate change. And then farming better, especially using regenerative practices that reduce emissions. And later I'll show you, maybe even create carbon sinks. We can go into other sectors more briefly, like industry. That's going to be really important because we make so many different things and deal with so many waste streams in the industrial sector. Like metals, steel is going to be a big player in climate change. Cement is a huge player. Chemistry, kind of chemicals that are being made, especially polymers and plastics. That's a good percent or two in there too. And managing all the world's waste streams are going to be very important as well. Transportation is going to be very important. We have to deal with about 14% of emissions globally there. But if you live in California, it's actually about half of your emissions are due to transportation in California. But globally, 14%, and most of that is roads. Flying is about a little less than 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. But it's, a lot of that's caused by a small number of people flying a lot, who maybe we could kind of modify some of that behavior. But road transportation is going to be really critical too, especially cars and trucks. And again, fuel efficiency and electrification and alternative modes of transportation are really critical here. And so we've got to use what we got more efficiently, shift to alternatives, and electrify. That's going to be crucial. Buildings will be really important too. And buildings directly emit about 6% of greenhouse gases. Of course, they use electricity and are built from stuff that emits carbon as well. But in the building emissions that are directly from buildings, from the furnaces, hot water heaters, and boilers, it's about 4% residential, 2% commercial and public buildings. A lot of homes and a lot of apartments and so on will need to be retrofitted with things like heat pumps and things that could be electrified and more efficient and produce less greenhouse gases. And we have lots of solutions here, again, around efficiency and shifting energy sources. What have we learned, though, so far is that we've learned that a lot of our climate solutions start with efficiency. Efficiency with buildings, electricity, even the food sector leads with efficiency. And then simultaneously switching to low carbon ways of making the things we like electricity and food and materials and homes. So efficiency combined with a big pivot in the economy is a 1-2 punch that can help us dramatically reduce climate emissions from a lot of the things we care about. Note too that I haven't said anything about giving up having electricity or not having food or not having buildings. Hell no. We can do these things. We just have to be more efficient and smarter and base them on 21st century technologies, not 19th century technologies. We also, though, have to work with nature and continue to support these carbon sinks that I mentioned before, these things that are removing carbon out of the atmosphere. Right now, this is entirely nature. We humans are not even making a dent in this yet, but we could. But right now, it's land, on basically forest, and the oceans that are removing greenhouse gases, and we need to protect those so healthy forest and healthy oceans continue to remove some of that pollution. If we can take 40% of the problem away by protecting nature, that's a good deal. So let's look at how we can support sinks, but maybe even add a few of our own. Well, on land, there are lots of ways to do this, but the big ones are going to be in the middle of this diagram, protecting and restoring nature, starting with nature because it's doing the big job already, protecting and restoring forest in the tropics and the temperate latitudes and so on. On the left-hand side, there's putting our farmland into play, using what we might call regenerative agriculture. I'm actually more interested in agroforestry, adding more trees to the landscape. Also what's called silvopasture, having cattle and trees coexisting. Lots of different opportunities here to make agriculture a carbon sink instead of a carbon source. And on the far right is using degraded lands that used to be in farming, and bring them back to health. There may be ways we can also use the oceans to become carbon sinks, but right now the big job is protecting what nature's already doing in the oceans, which is really crucial. And then later, someday, I'm not going to be betting much on this for a long time though, are machines that can also remove carbon out of the atmosphere. But so far, nothing can beat the performance of a tree or a good farm, not even close. There's a lot of hype right now about direct carbon removal and capture and storage, but right now, basically, it's hype. There's a few prototypes, but nothing that's scalable yet to be meaningful to the atmosphere, maybe in 10 to 20 years. In the meantime, we can't afford to wait for these. We have to reduce the sources dramatically now and use nature to remove what we can. And when these machines come online, and they will eventually, let's use them, but don't wait for them and don't bet on them. That would be betting the whole planet, and they can't do that. Another principle I haven't talked about much, but is also important. First, we reduce pollution. Second, we work with nature to maintain and augment sinks that we have, but we also can work with society, things that are important to do because they're good for people in general. For example, education of women and girls, or helping indigenous communities protect their land rights, things like that, that don't appear to be climate solutions, but often generate additional climate solutions across society and have kind of a 1-2 punch and kind of a domino effect of climate solutions. And in the big picture, we put all this together by reducing pollution across these big areas, by working with nature and maybe augmenting it with natural kinds of sinks of carbon on land and oceans and machines, maybe, and also things that improve society, especially healthcare and education for women and girls, indigenous community land rights, et cetera. We have lots of different climate solutions. These circles represent whole bundles of solutions that are dozens of which are inside each circle. And we can put them all together and we can change the world. It turns out with solutions we already have, we can bend the curve of temperature change, just like we bend the curve with pandemics, where the red curve would be where we're headed now, but we can choose a different future, maybe the yellow one, and better yet, the green one, where the planet would not be warming out of control, but where we could still get to maybe 1.5 degrees warmer or 2 degrees warmer, both of which are part of what's called the Paris Agreements on climate change. We can still meet those and stop climate change before it gets really out of control. 1.5 degrees is still bad, but it's a hell of a lot better than 2, 3, 4 degrees or 5, which is where we'd be headed otherwise. Well, what have we learned? We've learned a lot. That first of all, it is not too late to stop climate change from getting a lot worse. We have the tools we need. We have the solutions to stop climate change right now. All the solutions I talked about, by the way, exist today. We didn't put anything that's just in a laboratory. All of them are real and happen right now. So we have the solutions to stop climate change in our hands. We just have to get moving. And the good news is these solutions make the world better. They help us by addressing climate change, but they also create jobs. They create economic opportunity. They can also, if done wisely, help promote more equity and justice around the world and have many, many co-benefits to nature, people, and the economy. Time, though, is really crucial. Is that we must act quickly because what we don't have is time to waste. We've wasted the last 30 to 40 years waiting for climate change solutions. Now we have to use what we have now, not wait for new solutions. To make sure that these happen quickly, we've got to level up these solutions and scale them dramatically by changing policy and rules, shifting human and financial capital, changing the behavior of businesses, but also ourselves, and helping to advance technologies that help scale these solutions, making them cheaper and more ubiquitous as quickly as possible. We need all of these. It's not just policy, it's not just business, it's not just behavior, it's all of the above. And we can do this over time, over the next few decades, by deploying the solutions we have now quickly, like energy efficiency, food waste, deforestation, switching to renewables, which are now cheaper than any other form of electricity. And we can also think about solutions in the future where we have to address infrastructure, things like buildings, transportation networks, agriculture, things that require basically a renovation of the entire world. And then finally, in wrapping up here, we can use technologies to help us scale what we already know how to do cheaper and faster and better over time. All of these things will work over the next 2 to 3 decades and is a very good plan for us to address climate change. And wrapping up here, I see I'm out of time. I want to just say that, again, addressing climate change isn't just a chore, it's also an opportunity to make a better world. We don't only have to reimagine the world, we get to reimagine the world and build one that's right for the 21st century, for today's needs, today's aspirations, today's people, not just addressing climate change, but addressing our biggest issues around human well-being, the environment, justice, and so on. But we also need to have a better and bolder vision of a better world. Martin Luther King didn't go around America saying that he had a nightmare. He said, I have a dream of a better world, not a worse world. And he invited all of us to join him in building that dream and making it a reality. I think with that kind of articulation of climate change, that we can see a better world, not just a grim world, but a better world, and we can all be part of joining together and building it. That's the kind of leadership we need to address climate change. And my ask of you is to be part of that leadership, to use your leadership in your business, your community, your networks, your influence to help make that vision a reality. And remember, the future is up for grabs. We haven't built it yet. We all get to take some of the risk and accept some of the responsibility of consciously creating a better future. And with that, I want to just say thank you and point you to some resources here and look forward to the panel discussion. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, John. Wow, I love everything about that. I love the positivity. I love the solutions-oriented approach to things. I love the fact that we're working with nature to solve problems as opposed to fighting it. And I love the idea that the solutions are here. We just need to tap into them. So to that end, before we bring in the panel, John, just a quick question. It's not a quick answer, I'm sure, but we only have a little bit of time. I'm sure a lot of companies saying, John, I love everything you're saying. I love the idea of drawdown. I'm all in. How do we bring this to my company? How does a company, what's the insertion point? Is it bottom up? Is it middle out? Is it top down? What drives this kind of thinking in an organization?
That's a great question. And the answer, of course, is yes, all of the above. One of the things we like to do is help raise the level of ambition for companies. One of the things I think is a mistake is a lot of companies are now, and it's great that this is the beginning point, but it's to say, hey, let's look at our operational footprint, kind of our own personal responsibilities as companies and see how we can make those kind of net zero, maybe sometime in the distant future, kind of like a Paris, let's be net carbon neutral by 2040. 2050 or so. Well, first of all, that's not very ambitious. Net isn't good enough. We have to be 0-0, not just net zero. And 2040, 2050, if you put out a sales goal that was that far in the future, you'd be laughed at by your leadership. So why are you putting the most important goal of all, like preserving the planet, off into the future where nobody can be held accountable to it? That doesn't smell right to a lot of folks. I think we need more tactical goals in the near term, much more ambitious goals, and also, most of all, look beyond your corporate footprint. Ask what your overall leadership position is. How can you influence your customers, the community, the larger political discourse? I'll mention one company, for example, and full disclosure, they help support us, so we work with them. But Intuit, the folks who make TurboTax and QuickBooks, for example, we worked with them to help develop a program that says they're not going to just be carbon neutral. They decided to go 50 times beyond carbon neutral and do it by the end of this decade. And they're doing it by helping their customers. They realized that if only a fraction of a percent of one of their customers started to do carbon work, it would be bigger than their own corporate footprint because their customers are far bigger in total than they were. And I think that's brilliant. We see Microsoft taking out some leadership positions like this too. Ingersoll Rand, Train Corporation, a bunch of others are saying, hey, we can influence more than our own, scope 1, 2, and 3 footprints. We can go to scope 4 and talk about our customers, the communities, our employees, and put out a kind of a leadership stake out in the world that's bigger than that and do it faster and bigger than ever before. That kind of leadership is starting to happen, and it's really exciting. I just think we need to follow these innovators and see what we can do together.